She wasn't a partner. She was a possession. For 7 years, Norma Jean was Kingmaker, Porter Wagoner's most prized possession. She was known as Pretty Miss, the voice and the face of his show. And when he found something brighter, something newer, he dumped her. Her disappearance wasn't a tragedy. It was a business transaction. This isn't the story of a band. This is the indictment of a woman, traded like a commodity whose time had come. The story begins not in the neon glow of Nashville, but in the harsh, unforgiving, and deeply isolated landscape of the Missouri Ozarks. Porter Wayne Wagoner was born on August 12, 1927, in the tiny rural community of West Plains, Missouri. He was one of 5 children born to Charles and Annie Lee Wagoner. To say they were poor would be an understatement. They were tenant farmers, which was a polite term for a life of grueling, thankless labor on land they would never own, perpetually in debt to a landlord for the right to work it. Porter was born just 2 years before the stock market crash of 1929. His entire childhood was defined, scarred, and shaped by the singular crushing weight of the Great Depression. This wasn't just a temporary hardship. It was the Dust Bowl, drought, and constant scarcity of a life permanently defined by poverty. It was a world without softness, a world where survival was the only ambition. The fear of poverty never left him. Every deal, every glittering suit was another attempt to outrun that past. Every rhinestone suit and contract was his armor against the poverty he'd known. His ambition wasn't driven by fame. It was driven by survival. He built his success like a fortress, determined that poverty would never reach him again. This created the central contradiction of his entire persona. At heart, he was a working-class showman, building an empire on glitter and rhinestones. But his appeal, the very thing that made him a star, was the unvarnished, authentic, mock-mack sincerity of his voice. It was the sound of the Ozarks. He was the common man in a king's costume, forever trying to reconcile the two. Like every boy in that time and place, he was put to work as soon as he could walk. He helped his family on the farm, a life of sunup to sundown labor. But his escape, his first real opportunity, came not from a guitar, but from a butcher's knife. As a teenager, he took a job at a local butcher shop in West Plains, owned by a man named Fred C. Shorty McKenzie. This job was his first stage, and it was here, amidst the sawdust and raw meat, that the future mogul was born. Porter was a natural-born performer, even as a butcher. He had a quick wit and an easy charm. He sang as he worked. His boss, Shorty, was a savvy promoter in his own right. He recognized the charisma in the young man slicing cuts of meat. To attract and retain customers during a time of intense rationing and scarcity, McKenzie sponsored a small 15-minute radio spot on the local station, KWPM, and the star of that spot was the singing butcher, Porter Wagoner. Think about this. This is the crucible moment. While other future stars were learning music as an art form, as a spiritual release, Porter Wagoner was learning music as a tool of commerce. His first performances were, quite literally, advertisements. He would sing a song, his clear Ozark-inflected voice crackling over the local airwaves, and then he would tell the listeners about the fresh cuts of meat available at the shop. He was learning a crucial, fundamental lesson that would define his entire career. A song was a way to sell a product. The performance was a way to build a brand. The radio was a way to move inventory. He never stopped being that butcher. Only the product changed from meat to music to the brand of Porter Wagoner. This commercial, almost cynical understanding of music as a business, first and foremost, is the key to understanding his future relationships, his desperate need for control, and his spectacular, tragic clashes with the very artists he would mentor. While many of his contemporaries and a generation of country stars were being shipped off to fight in World War II, Porter remained home. There's no evidence he served. His focus was singular. His war was the one against poverty, and his draft notice was for a different kind of service. The 1940s were his training ground. He was a local celebrity, the boy from the butcher shop. He honed his craft not in a barracks, but on the local radio circuits. He became the featured vocalist for a local radio trio, the Blue Ridge Boys, and his popularity grew. He was building his persona piece by piece. He was the Thin Man from West Plains, a nickname that stuck, highlighting his tall, lanky frame. He was learning how to command a stage, how to talk to an audience, how to use that down-home Ozark charm as both a shield and a weapon. He was a man divided. By day, he was still a working-class boy, his hands calloused. By night, he was a local star, his ambition burning so brightly it was visible. This deep internal split, the humble farm boy versus the aspiring showman, was the engine that would soon propel him out of West Plains and onto the national stage. His first major break came from just down the road in Springfield, Missouri. Springfield was a major hub for live country music, home to the powerful radio station KWTO, which broadcast the nationally syndicated show, Ozark Jubilee. This was the big league. This was the cradle of the stars. In 1950, Porter auditioned. He was hired immediately as a featured performer. At KWTO in Springfield, he shared bills with rising stars like Red Foley just before Ozark Jubilee became nationally syndicated. This was no longer the 15-minute butcher shop spot. This was a professional, high-stakes operation. It was at KWTO that Porter learned the business of music. He watched how contracts were written. He watched how tours were booked. He watched Nashville producers, including RCA scouts, visit Springfield to recruit new talent. He was a sponge, absorbing not just the music, but the mechanics of the industry. He saw how artists, even famous ones, could be exploited, how they could lose control of their own names, their own songs. This observation solidified his primary directive. Porter Wagoner swore to himself that he would never be beholden to anyone. He would never be a tenant farmer in the music business. He wouldn't just be the talent, he would be the landlord. In 1951, his regional fame caught the attention of the biggest label in the business, RCA Victor. They saw in Porter the perfect, marketable commodity, a handsome, charismatic young man with an authentic hillbilly voice, but with the ambition and professionalism of a pop star. They signed him. For the first few years, he struggled. He was releasing records, but nothing was catching fire. He was one of many voices in a crowded market. The pressure was immense. He had left the security of his local radio fame for the cutthroat world of Nashville, and it looked for a moment like he might fail. For a man defined by a fear of failure, this was a terrifying prospect. But Porter was more than just a singer. He was a songwriter, and he was, above all, a businessman who understood his brand. He knew he needed a hit, but he also knew that the hillbilly sound was beginning to change. The world was craving something more. He was biding his time, waiting for the right song, the right vehicle to launch the empire he was already blueprinting in his mind. He was no longer just the butcher. He was the man designing the whole supermarket. And as Porter was plotting his ascent in Springfield, a different story was unfolding just a few hundred miles away, across the border in Oklahoma. A young girl, with a voice as raw and real as the red dirt she grew up on, was just beginning to sing. She too was a child of poverty, one of 10. She too had a dream. She didn't know it yet, but her destiny, her greatest triumph, and her most profound heartbreak was intertwined with the ambitious thin man from West Plains. Her name was Norma Jean, As Porter Wagoner was laying the foundation for his commercial empire in Missouri, a different kind of voice was being forged in the red dirt of Oklahoma. If Porter's story was a desperate run from poverty, this new story was about the struggle to find a voice within it. On January 30th, 1938, Norma Jean Beasler was born in the small rural town of Wellston, Oklahoma. If Porter's family of 5 children in West Plains was poor, Norma Jean's was destitute. She was the youngest of 10. Let us pause and understand what that means. To be the 10th child in a poor rural family during the Great Depression is to be born into a world that has already run out of space for you. It is to inherit the last of everything, the most mended clothes, the smallest portion, the last sliver of attention. It is to be, in a sense, an afterthought. This environment, this fight for basic acknowledgement, became the psychological crucible for Norma Jean. From the moment she was born, she was in a crowd. Her childhood wasn't just a struggle against poverty. It was a struggle to be seen, to be heard, to find an identity. For a small girl in a large, loud, and struggling family, a voice wasn't just for speaking, it was for existing. And Norma Jean, it turned out, had a voice that could cut through any noise. Her musical education was not like Porter's, a commercial enterprise in a butcher shop. It was pure, elemental, and it came from 2 distinct springs. The first was her mother. While her father and brothers worked, her mother filled the small home with the fiery, heartfelt, and deeply emotional sounds of gospel music. This was Norma Jean's first language. She learned that singing was not about polish or perfection. It was about testimony. It was about bearing witness to your struggles and your faith. It was the sound of pure, unfiltered human emotion. This is where her power came from, a deep well of spiritual and emotional sincerity. The second spring was the radio. In the evenings, the family would huddle around the battery-powered box and listen to the crackling broadcasts from faraway places. They heard the blue yodeler, Jimmy Rogers, whose songs were tales of rambling men and broken hearts. But more importantly, they heard the women who were, against all odds, breaking through. They heard the sounds of Patsy Montana. This was not a trivial influence. In 1935, Patsy Montana had become the first female country artist to have a million-selling record with I Want to Be a Cowboy Sweetheart. For a young poor girl in Oklahoma, Patsy Montana was not just a singer. She was a possibility. Patsy Montana was the star, not just a girl singer. She was a yodeler, a performer, a self-contained force. She provided a blueprint, however faint, for a life outside of Wellston, a life of independence. These 2 influences, the sacred soul of her mother's gospel and the secular independence of the cowboy's sweetheart, melded to create something unique. By the time she was a young teenager, Norma Jean possessed a voice that was utterly, almost aggressively, authentic. Her voice was raw and emotional, too real for the polished 1950s Nashville sound, but impossible to ignore. Like Porter, she began to find her way onto local radio. In her mid-teens, she was already a regular performer on KLPR in Oklahoma City. This was the first proving ground, and it was here she learned the hard realities of her chosen path. This was the 1950s. A girl singer was an ornament. She was pretty miss. She was there to smile, to look good in a gingham dress, and to sing a song or 2 before the real star, the man, came back on. The industry was a fortress built by and for men. A woman's ambition was tolerated, but her independence was not. Norma Jean wasn't just learning to sing in key. She was learning to navigate a deeply sexist system. She was learning to be tough, to be resilient, and to hold on to that rough-edged authenticity in a world that was constantly trying to sand it down. But her talent was too obvious, too raw to be kept in Oklahoma City. The word began to spread about this teenage girl with the powerhouse voice, and that word reached Springfield, Missouri. In the mid-1950s, Norma Jean was offered a coveted spot on the biggest stage of her life, the Ozark Jubilee. This is the critical point of convergence. The Ozark Jubilee, broadcast from Springfield on KWTO, was the very same show, the very same stage that had launched Porter Wagoner just a few years earlier. It was the cradle of the stars for the entire region. As Porter was graduating from the Jubilee to the Grand Ole Opry, Norma Jean was arriving, walking in his footsteps, breathing the same air, and proving herself to the same audience. She became a regional favorite. Her sincerity, her lack of artifice, was a stunning contrast to the increasingly polished performers of the day. She was more than a girl singer. She was a force. And that force was noticed once again by the men in suits from Nashville. RCA Victor, the same label that had signed Porter Wagoner, saw what they had. They already had their flashy male star in Porter. Now, in Norma Jean, they saw his perfect counterpart. She was the authentic, the down-to-earth, the real. They signed her to a recording contract. At the age of 19, Norma Jean Beasler was now a nationally syndicated television star and an RCA Victor recording artist. She was on the exact same trajectory as the thin man from West Plains. And in Nashville, Porter Wagoner, now a full-fledged superstar, was watching. His career, since leaving the Jubilee, had exploded. In 1955, he recorded the song that would become his anthem, A Satisfied Mind. The song was a masterpiece of his central contradiction. It was a mournful philosophical ballad about the emptiness of wealth, a plea for spiritual peace over material gain. And it was sung by Porter Wagoner, the man most desperately driven by the ghosts of poverty, the man who craved material success as the ultimate proof of his existence. The song's profound sincerity, delivered by a man living its direct contradiction, resonated with a post-war America grappling with its new prosperity. It was a massive career-defining hit. It shot to #1 on the country charts and stayed there for 4 weeks. The butcher from West Plains was now one of the biggest stars in the nation. 2 years later, in 1957, he received the ultimate coronation. He was invited to become a member of the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. This was it. He had arrived. He was a peer of the legends, Roy Acuff, Ernest Tubb. He had beaten poverty. He had built the foundation of his fortress. But Porter wasn't satisfied. Being a star wasn't enough. He wanted to be an institution. He began meticulously crafting his brand, his flash. He adopted the tall, severe, flat-top haircut, and he discovered the nudie suit, designed by Nudie Cohn, the legendary tailor to country stars. These were not mere outfits. They were weapons of mass distraction. They were statements of intent. They were emblazoned with glittering rhinestones, intricate hand-sewn wagon wheels, cacti, and covered bridges. While other performers wore simple Western shirts, Porter wore a constellation. This was his armor. This was his boojap for the patched-up clothes of his childhood. Every single rhinestone was a nail in the coffin of his poor past. He was no longer Charles Wagoner's boy. He was Porter Wagoner, a walking, glittering spectacle. He was at the peak of his power. He was an Opry star, an RCA hitmaker, and the most recognizable man in country music. And he had a new, radical idea, an idea that many in the conservative world of Nashville thought was foolish. He wanted to bring country music in all its rhinestone glory to the new, powerful medium of television. He envisioned a syndicated show, a weekly broadcast that would bypass the Nashville network gatekeepers and be beamed directly into living rooms across America. It would be his show, his brand, his rules. He would be the master of ceremonies, the headliner, the producer, the boss. He was building his empire. He had the stage, he had the fame, he had the suits. But he needed one more thing. He needed a girl singer. He needed someone to soften his glittering commercial edge. He needed someone authentic, someone real, someone who could be the Ozark heart to his Hollywood spectacle. He knew exactly who to call. He remembered the girl from Oklahoma, the one with the rough-edged hillbilly voice who had taken his old spot on the Jubilee. He remembered Norma Jean. In 1960, Porter Wagoner's vision became a reality. He secured the sponsorship and the syndication deals. The Porter Wagoner Show was greenlit. It was set to be filmed and broadcast from Nashville, a weekly half-hour dose of pure, undiluted country music beamed directly into living rooms across America. It was a revolutionary concept. At a time when network television was dominated by sitcoms and westerns, Porter was betting millions that a hillbilly show, if produced with slick professional quality, could conquer the nation. He was the master of ceremonies, the headliner, the executive producer, and the creative director. The show was not just starring Porter Wagoner. The show was Porter Wagoner. It was the physical manifestation of the citadel he had been building his entire life, a glittering empire of his own design, where he finally had total, absolute control. He had the stage, he had the band, he had the nudie suits, which were becoming more elaborate by the week. He had the humor, provided by his longtime friend, the comedian Spec Rhodes. He needed one final piece. He needed the girl singer. This was not just a supporting role. It was, in Porter's commercial mind, a critical piece of branding. She was the counterbalance. He was the flash, the spectacle, the man in the $1,000 suit. He needed someone to be the heart. He needed the down-to-earth, the authentic, the girl next door from the Ozarks, the very thing he himself had once been, but had now, quite deliberately, evolved beyond. He didn't just need a singer, he needed an anchor. He remembered Norma Jean Beasler. He didn't just remember her, he recognized her value. He had watched her on the Ozark Jubilee. He knew her voice, that raw, rough-edged sound of pure, unvarnished Oklahoma. He knew her reputation, professional, beloved by audiences, and perhaps most importantly, available. She was signed to his same label, RCA. It was a perfect, synergistic fit. In late 1960, the call was made. It was not, by any account, a negotiation between equals. This was not a partnership, it was a job offer. Porter Wagoner, the 33-year-old superstar and television boss, was summoning Norma Jean, the 22-year-old regional performer, to join his new empire. For Norma Jean, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. This was the call. This was the ticket out of the minor leagues and into the absolute center of the country music universe. It was a chance to be on national television every single week, to tour with the biggest star in the business, and to have her own RCA career amplified by that massive platform. She said yes. When the Porter Wagoner Show premiered in 1960, Norma Jean joined soon after, and from her first appearance, the dynamic was set. Porter, the ringmaster, would introduce her with a specific paternalistic affection. She was pretty Miss Norma Jean. This persona was a stroke of marketing genius. It was everything the audience needed her to be. Pretty acknowledged her undeniable fresh-faced beauty. Miss established her as single, approachable, the girl next door, a crucial part of the fantasy. And Norma Jean retained that authentic, rural, hillbilly identity. She was the show's soul, and it worked. The Porter Wagoner Show was an instant, massive success. It didn't just find an audience, it dominated its time slots. It became a Saturday evening ritual in households from rural Alabama to urban Ohio. Porter had been right. America was starving for this. The pairing of Porter and Norma Jean was the core of that success. It was the perfect synthesis of Porter's central contradiction. He would stand there, a towering 6'4" figure, almost alien in a suit so bright with rhinestones, it practically vibrated. He was the thin man, the spectacle. And then he would turn, smile, and introduce pretty Miss Norma Jean. She would walk out, often in a modest but fashionable dress, and she would ground him. She was the human anchor to his rhinestone rocket. He was the Hollywood showman. She was the Oklahoma heart. The audience adored her. They didn't just respect her, they loved her. They saw her as their sister, their daughter, the local girl who had made it big but hadn't changed. She wasn't just a sidekick. She was, for a huge portion of the audience, the main event. And this platform, as Porter had promised, turned her from a regional star into a national one. Her own recording career with RCA Victor exploded. In 1964, she recorded and released Let's Go All the Way. This was not a shy, retiring ballad. It was a feisty, forward, and borderline suggestive song. Coming from the pretty miss of television, it was a shockwave. Her rough-edged hillbilly voice gave it a grit and honesty that was electric. It was a massive hit, peaking at number 11 on the Billboard country charts. She was no longer just Porter's girl singer. She was a star. She followed it with hits like Go Cat Go, 1965, and I'm a Walking Advertisement for the Blues, 1966. Her 1965 album, aptly titled Pretty Miss Norma Jean, was a massive seller. She received 1 Grammy nomination in 1967 for You're Driving You Out of My Mind. She was, by all accounts, one of the most successful and beloved women in country music. Porter, too, was at his absolute peak. His platform was selling his records by the truckload. Misery Loves Company was a number 1 hit in 1962. His iconic version of Green, Green Grass of Home was a smash in 1965. They were the king and queen of country television. Their chemistry was undeniable. They toured together, they recorded together, they sang duets on the show. They were, to the outside world, the perfect power couple, a seamless blend of flash and heart, but that, as we know, was the lie. Behind the cameras, a different, far more complex and far more toxic story was unfolding. The relationship was not one of equals. It was one of absolute, suffocating control. Porter Wagoner, the man haunted by the ghost of his tenant farmer father, the man who had seen his own boss at the butcher shop use music as a tool, was now the landlord, and his control over his empire was total. To Porter, Norma Jean wasn't a partner. She was an employee. He controlled everything. He controlled the show's direction, the song choices, the production, the spotlight. If Norma Jean had a hit, it was his platform that made it a hit. If she was famous, it was because he introduced her every week. She was a part of his brand. She was perhaps his most prized possession. This professional hierarchy was complicated by a dark, open secret. It was widely rumored, though never confirmed, that Porter and Norma Jean were not just colleagues. They were lovers. Let us be clear about this dynamic. This was the 1960s. This was not a relationship between two equal stars. This was a relationship between a powerful, established male boss and his much younger female employee in an industry where he held all the cards. This is the lie behind the perfect couple image. It was a toxic, complex, and deeply fraught blend of professional subservience and alleged personal intimacy. For Norma Jean, this was the golden cage. She was, on paper, living the dream. She was one of the most famous women in America. She had hit records, money, and the adoration of millions. But she had no autonomy. She was trapped. Every song she sang, every dress she wore, every public appearance she made was filtered through the lens of Porter Wagoner. Her success was not her own, it was theirs. And theirs, in Porter's world, meant his. As her own star began to rise, as she began to get Grammy nominations, as her records began to sell, that cage began to feel smaller and smaller. Norma Jean, the girl from Oklahoma, the youngest of 10, the one who had to fight to be heard, was not built for captivity. She was deeply grateful for the opportunity. She was, by all accounts, fiercely loyal to Porter, but she was also a woman with her own desires, her own ambitions. She wanted a stable life. She wanted a home. She wanted a marriage, not to her boss, but to someone outside the suffocating orbit of the show. And in 1966, she found him. She met and fell in love with a man named Jody Taylor, a man who was not in the music business. This, for Porter, was a catastrophe. It was not just a personal betrayal, as he may have seen it. It was a business crisis. A married pretty Miss Norma Jean was not the same fantasy. A pretty miss with a husband and a home of her own was no longer the accessible girl next door. But the greatest threat was this: a woman with a stable private life, a woman with a husband, is an independent woman. She is not a woman who needs her boss. She is not a woman he could control. This wasn't just a threat to Porter's empire. It was a direct threat to his entire psyche. The thin man, who had built a fortress to keep the outside world out, now faced a rebellion from within its walls. The tension on set became unbearable. Porter, feeling betrayed and abandoned, reportedly gave her an ultimatum. It was the show or the man. It was his world or her life. In 1967, at the height of her fame, Norma Jean Beasler made a choice. It was unthinkable, radical, career suicidal. She chose herself. She chose stability. She chose marriage. She chose to leave the Porter Wagoner show. She had escaped the gilded cage, but in doing so, she also signed the death warrant of her own career. It was 1967, and the most successful, stable, and beloved show in country music was suddenly in dire straits. Pretty Miss Norma Jean was gone. For Porter Wagoner, this was not just a breakup. It was not just a personal betrayal, though it was almost certainly that too. This was a 5-alarm fire. This was a business emergency. Let us for a moment step inside the mind of Porter Wagoner, the mogul. The thin man from West Plains was not just a performer. He was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation, and the Porter Wagoner show was his flagship product. That product was sold in a package to 100 television markets across the country. That package, that brand, was built on consistency. It was built on the rock-solid, predictable chemistry of Porter, his comedian Spec Rhodes, and the reliable, down-home heart of pretty Miss Norma Jean. And she had just walked out. She had broken the brand. She had, in Porter's mind, jeopardized the entire empire. The shadow of his tenant farmer past, the specter of poverty that had chased him his entire life, was now banging on the door of his rhinestone fortress. An empire without its queen is vulnerable, and Porter Wagoner hated being vulnerable. His reaction was not one of quiet sadness or thoughtful transition. It was one of pure, uncut, pragmatic panic. He was not a jilted lover. He was a mogul whose main asset had just abandoned her post. The show, his syndication deals, his entire financial structure depended on that girl singer spot being filled. Immediately, he was not looking for a new partner. He was plugging a hole in a dam. The hunt was on, and it was frantic. Even before Norma Jean's final episodes had aired, Porter was desperately, almost angrily, searching for her replacement. He needed someone. But who could possibly replace Norma Jean? She was the perfect, authentic girl next door. She was the image of rural purity. How do you find that again? The answer is you don't. Instead, Porter Wagoner, in a move of pure, instinctive, and deeply flawed genius, went in the exact opposite direction. He found a young, 21-year-old songwriter from the mountains of East Tennessee. She had just landed a minor hit with a novelty song called Dumb Blonde. She was quirky. She was ambitious, almost terrifyingly so. And she was, in every conceivable way, the visual opposite of Norma Jean. Her name was Dolly Parton. Let's analyze this choice. This is the pivotal, tragic, and central irony of Porter Wagoner's entire life. Norma Jean was the authentic. She was the rough-edged hillbilly, the down-to-earth Oklahoman. Her image was more or less real, and that reality, that authenticity, had given her the strength and the autonomy to defy him. Her realness was what had allowed her to walk away. Dolly Parton in 1967 was a construct. She was, in a way, a female version of Porter himself. She was already wearing the cheap, flashy wigs. She was already wearing the bright, tight, artificial-looking outfits. Her voice wasn't the rough-edged sound of the past. It was a high, shimmering, pop-inflected soprano. In Porter's mind, the calculation must have been simple. He had just been betrayed by Miss Authentic. Now he would hire Miss Artificial. He saw this young, bubbly, seemingly synthetic girl and believed he had found someone malleable, someone he could mold, someone whose entire manufactured image would be dependent on him, the star maker. He thought he was hiring a doll. He had, in fact, just hired his master. He had just invited a strategic genius, a future empress, into the heart of his fortress. He had replaced the woman who wanted a simple, autonomous life with a woman who wanted the world, and he had no idea. The transition was swift, brutal, and a public relations disaster. In 1967, audiences saw their beloved pretty Miss Norma Jean. The next week, she was gone. No protracted farewell, no tearful goodbye. Vanished. And in her place stood this new girl, this small, shimmering, peroxide blonde stranger. The audience reaction was not one of confusion. It was one of pure, unadulterated rage. Dolly Parton herself would recall this period as the most painful and terrifying of her entire career. The studio audience, the one that had adored Norma Jean, was openly hostile. They booed. They heckled. When Porter would introduce her, a wave of cold silence would fall over the crowd, followed by murmurs. On the road, it was even worse. The live audience, the ones who had paid their hard-earned money, felt betrayed. They felt that Porter had, without their permission, replaced their favorite family member. In theaters and auditoriums across America, the chant would go up, a deafening, humiliating roar, "We want Norma Jean." Night after night, Dolly Parton, 21 years old, had to walk out into that wall of rejection. She would cry backstage, and Porter, in a rage, would push her back out. This moment reveals everything about Porter's psychology. He wasn't just introducing a new singer. He was commanding his audience to accept her. This was not a request. It was an exercise in control. He was the boss. He was the landlord. And this was his new tenant. He would force them to love her. This was the thin man from West Plains, the man who would not be denied, the man whose fear of failure and abandonment was so great that he would rather burn down his own audience than admit he had made a mistake. He doubled down. He featured Dolly more. He sang duets with her, their voices clashing in an unfamiliar, high-strung harmony. He was, in essence, holding his own show hostage until the audience gave in. And, slowly, they did. Because Dolly Parton was and is a supernova. Her talent was too bright, her charm too infectious, her songwriting too brilliant to be denied for long. She and Porter recorded their first duets, "The Last Thing on My Mind" and "Just Someone I Used to Know." The songs were hits. The chemistry, though fraught with a new kind of tension, was undeniable. The audience, begrudgingly at first, and then, with overwhelming enthusiasm, accepted the new order. Dolly Parton was the new girl singer. The erasure of Norma Jean had begun. So what happened to Norma Jean? She did exactly what she said she was going to do. She married her fiancé, Jody Taylor. She left Nashville, bought a home, and tried to build the stable, normal life she had craved for so long. She did not, however, quit the music business. She was, after all, still a major star, a Grammy-nominated artist under contract with RCA Victor. She simply and quietly transitioned to a solo career, just as she had always wanted. She continued to record, releasing her own albums. She continued to be a beloved standing member of the Grand Ole Opry, appearing on its stage whenever she was in town. But the hits stopped. Let's analyze this erasure, because it was not a passive event. It was a systemic one, engineered, perhaps not even consciously, by Porter Wagoner himself. Norma Jean's hits had been driven by one singular, massive engine, the Porter Wagoner Show. Her songs were heard by millions of people every single week for free. That television platform was the most powerful promotional tool in country music, and Porter owned it. The moment Norma Jean walked off that show, she didn't just leave a job. She unplugged herself from her entire promotional infrastructure. RCA, her label, was not stupid. They were in the business of selling records, and now their product, Norma Jean, no longer had her primary advertising slot. Their other product, the Porter and Dolly duets, was now the new hot commodity. Resources were shifted. Marketing budgets were reallocated. Norma Jean, the woman who had been a household name, was now just another singer in a very crowded field, fighting for airplay. This is the cold, hard butcher shop calculus of the music business, the very calculus Porter had mastered. Norma Jean had not just been his partner, she had been part of his synergy. By breaking that synergy, she had, in a business sense, rendered herself obsolete. Her solo career, for which she had fought so hard, now became a quiet but uphill battle. She released wonderful records. She toured. She played the Opry, but she was no longer a star. She was becoming a legend, which is the polite industry term for someone who is beloved, respected, and in the past. The public, fickle, and fed on a weekly diet of the new, simply forgot. The erasure was not an act of malice. It was an act of brutal commercial indifference. She had been replaced. Norma Jean herself handled this with a profound, almost heartbreaking grace. She never spoke ill of Porter. She never publicly lamented Dolly's success. She was a woman of deep faith, the girl from Oklahoma who had gotten to live a dream and who had then, on her own terms, chosen to wake up from it. She had her home. She had her husband. She had her autonomy. She had in her mind won. But in Nashville, the empire of Porter Wagoner was now, with Dolly Parton at his side, entering its most successful, most volatile, and most self-destructive phase. Porter, the ultimate control freak, had just lost a woman who simply wanted freedom, and he had replaced her with a woman who was a rival genius. In essence, he had just traded one problem for a much, much bigger one. He was the king of his rhinestone fortress, and he had just unwittingly brought in someone who knew how to build an even bigger fortress right next door with his own bricks. So the new power dynamic was established. The duets were big hits. The show was bigger than ever. On the surface, Porter seemed to have won. He had proven, once again, that he was in control. But the conflict that had defined his relationship with Norma Jean, the battle between control and autonomy, was actually about to repeat itself. Only this time, he wasn't facing a pretty lady who would quietly walk away. He was facing Dolly. And that war, when it finally broke out, would not end in a quiet resignation. It would end in a public, multi-million-dollar battle, a war that would define both of them and cast a shadow so large that the woman who came before, pretty Miss Norma Jean, would be left in near total obscurity. But that enormous shadow of the future was rooted in an event in the present. The departure of Norma Jean in 1967 was, in fact, a quiet, seismic event. It was a personal decision, handled with as much dignity as possible in a volatile situation. And Porter Wagoner's empire, for the first time, had been successfully challenged. But the television machine does not stop because of a broken heart, nor does it pause because of a contract dispute. The machine must be fed, and so the great tragic and systematic erasure of pretty Miss Norma Jean began, not as an act of malice, but simply as a matter of essential, brutal necessity. The new product was Dolly Parton. We must return to that moment of transition, for it is one of the most misunderstood and crucial in country music history. The audience, as we noted, was furious. They did not just miss Norma Jean, they resented her replacement. They saw Dolly with her high-stacked wigs, her bright, tight-fitting clothes, and her trembling, pop-inflected soprano as a betrayal of the very authenticity that Norma Jean had represented. For the first year of Dolly Parton's tenure, she was, by her own admission, miserable. She was a 21-year-old girl living in a state of constant public rejection. The boos were real. The audience's relentless calls for her predecessor were a nightly humiliation. But Porter Wagoner, the man whose entire identity was now fused with this television show, could not and would not fail. To admit he had made a mistake, to admit his new choice was a flop, would be to admit he had lost control. It would be a public validation of his vulnerability. The ghost of the tenant farmer, the boy who had nothing, could not, would not, be publicly humiliated. So he doubled down. He didn't just feature Dolly, he forced her upon his audience. He pushed her into the spotlight night after night, week after week, his own anger and frustration at the audience's rejection fueling his resolve. This was not a gentle introduction. It was a siege. Porter was, in essence, holding his own loyal audience hostage until they agreed to love his new star. This reveals everything about the man. He was no longer just a showman. He was a dictator, albeit a glittering, charismatic one. His will was paramount. The fortress of his success had to be defended at all costs, even from his own fans. And as the siege continued, two things began to happen. First, Dolly Parton, a survivor of her own East Tennessee poverty, a woman whose ambition and resilience dwarfed even Porter's, simply refused to break. She weathered the storm of boos. She smiled through the heckles. She absorbed the hatred of the crowd. And with a professionalism that belied her age, she performed. Second, she began to write. This is the fundamental world-altering difference between the two girl singers. Norma Jean was a brilliant interpreter. She was a voice. Dolly Parton was a creator. She was an engine. While Porter was busy fighting his audience, Dolly was backstage in her dressing room with her guitar, crafting the very songs that would soon make her a global icon. She was not just a sidekick, she was a songwriter. And she was, without question, a genius. The hits started to come. Porter and Dolly began recording duets. Their first, The Last Thing on My Mind, was a major hit in 1967. Their voices, so different, created a new kind of sound. It wasn't the down-home blend he'd had with Norma Jean. It was a high, fiery, almost tense harmony. It was the sound of two thoroughbreds pulling the same wagon, but both wanting to run in different directions, and it was electrifying. They followed it with Just Someone I Used to Know in 1969. The show's popularity surged again. The audience, won over by the undeniable quality of the music and Dolly's sheer, infectious charisma, finally relented. They stopped chanting for Norma Jean. They started screaming for Dolly. Porter had won. He had successfully, brutally replaced the irreplaceable. He had proven his will. His empire was secure, and in doing so, he had just sealed his own doom. He had just made the greatest strategic error of his life. The conflict he'd had with Norma Jean was a battle of will versus heart. She wanted autonomy. He wanted control. The new conflict, the one brewing with Dolly Parton, was a battle of empire versus empire. He, Porter, was the man haunted by the ghost of poverty. Dolly, she was the woman driven by the vision of destiny. And while this new war was beginning to brew, what of the woman who had started it all? What of pretty Miss Norma Jean? The erasure was now in full effect. Norma Jean did exactly what she had promised. She married Jody Taylor. She moved back to Oklahoma. She built the home she had always dreamed of. She had, in every personal sense, won. She had escaped the golden cage. She also, as promised, continued her career. She was still a major artist with RCA. She continued to release albums, records filled with her classic, rough-edged sound. But the hits, the ones that had come so easily when she was on television, were now much harder to find. In 1968, 1969, and 1970, she released singles. They were critically respected. They would bubble under the charts, but they did not hit the top 10. They did not get the radio play. Why? The reason was simple, and it was brutal. The Porter Wagoner Show was the single most powerful promotional engine in country music. It was the Kingmaker, and that engine was no longer selling her records. It was selling Dolly's. RCA Victor, the label they both shared, was a business. They were not in the game of loyalty. They were in the game of profit. Their marketing budgets, their promotional muscle, their radio pluggers, all of that energy was now redirected from Norma Jean to Porter and Dolly. Norma Jean had not just been replaced on television. She had been replaced on the balance sheet. The industry, which had once nominated her for Grammys, now treated her as a legacy act. She remained always a beloved and deeply respected member of the Grand Ole Opry. The Opry was her sanctuary, the one stage in Nashville where she was always treated not as the woman who came before Dolly, but as a star in her own right. She would perform there, and the crowd would give her a standing ovation, a warm embrace of nostalgia. But in the fast-moving commercial world of radio, she had, in just a few short years, become a ghost. And so we must ask the question, how did she feel? Did she sit at home in Oklahoma watching the Porter Wagoner Show with bitterness? Did she watch this new flashy girl singing duets with the man she had once loved, standing on her stage, and feel the sting of resentment? By all accounts, no. She felt more than anything a profound sense of relief. Norma Jean was among the few who truly knew the real Porter Wagoner. She was the only one who had lived for 7 years inside that rhinestone fortress. She knew the cost of his control. She knew the weight of his ambition. She knew the volatility, the anger, and the suffocating pressure of his will. She was not watching a rival succeed. She was watching her replacement fight the very same war that she had fled. She was watching Dolly Parton, this new girl, begin to strain under the exact same pressures. She was watching history repeat itself. She had not been defeated. She had escaped. She was finally free, with a home, a husband, and her autonomy. She had won the one thing that mattered more to her than fame. She had won her life. Meanwhile, back in Nashville, the new war was escalating. By 1970, Dolly Parton was not just a sidekick. She was a phenomenon. While she was still fulfilling her duties on Porter's show, her solo career was beginning to eclipse his. She recorded her version of Jimmie Rogers' Mule Skinner Blues, which became a hit in 1970. She released Joshua in late 1970, and it became her first #1 hit in early 1971. And then, in 1971, she wrote Coat of Many Colors. This is the perfect time to use this device. It was a deeply personal autobiographical story of her own impoverished childhood. It was, in its own way, her version of Porter's A Satisfied Mind. It was her wound, and it was a masterpiece. For Porter Wagoner, this was the ultimate crisis. His girl singer, his employee, the one he had hired to be his creation, was now a creative force far greater than he was. Porter, the landlord, was watching his tenant build a mansion on his property. His old wound, the ghost of poverty, the terror of losing control, roared to the surface. He had discovered her. He had made her. Therefore, he owned her. He began to assert his control, not just over the show, but over her. The dynamic became famously, legendarily toxic. He was her producer, her manager, and her boss. And he believed, as the man who had given her the platform, that he was entitled to a significant piece of her entire career. The battle centered on one thing: publishing. In music, the real generational wealth is not in performing. It is in owning the songs. Porter, the butcher from West Plains, understood this better than anyone. He was a savvy publisher, and he allegedly demanded a massive percentage of Dolly Parton's songwriting publishing. This was the ultimate expression of his butcher shop mentality. She was writing the songs, but he had provided the store. Therefore, he was entitled to half the profit. For Dolly, this was a line she would not cross. Her songs were not a commodity. They were her children. They were her soul. The fights became brutal. They were no longer just colleagues. They were warring titans, trapped on a television set, smiling for the cameras by day and waging a legal and emotional war by night. Dolly, just like Norma Jean before her, knew she had to leave. But unlike Norma Jean, she couldn't just walk away. Her contract was ironclad. Porter owned her legally. She was trapped, and the only way out was to fight. In 1973, she wrote Jolene, a global monster hit. It was bigger than anything Porter had ever done, and in that same year, in a burst of heartbreaking creative fire, she wrote her Declaration of Independence. She wrote the song that would be her peace treaty, her resignation letter, and her key to freedom. She wrote, "I Will Always Love You." The story is now legend. She walked into Porter's office, sat him down, and sang it to him and him alone. It was not a love song. It was a farewell. It was a song of profound, heartbreaking respect, but it was also an absolute, non-negotiable goodbye. Porter Wagoner, the thin man, the glittering showman, the man of total control, reportedly broke down and wept. Was he weeping for the loss of his partner? Or was he weeping because for the second time he had been beaten? Was he weeping because he knew in that moment that the girl he thought he owned was now the biggest star in the world, and she was leaving him? It was the definitive sound of the ultimate landlord, the absolute controller, suffering a final, irrevocable defeat. Their separation was no clean break. It was a grueling, multi-million-dollar war. To gain her emancipation, Dolly Parton paid a staggering price, reportedly $1 million, to buy her way out of the contracts that bound her. In 1974, she followed the same path Norma Jean had 7 years prior and walked away from the Porter Wagoner show. The great glittering fortress Porter had meticulously constructed to wall off the ghosts of his impoverished past was now, at last, vacant. He had conquered his history, achieved unparalleled success, and become the most powerful man in country music television. Yet, for all his victories, he was left utterly and profoundly alone. The 7-year conflict concluded that year. Dolly's parting gift was her farewell hymn, "I Will Always Love You," a song of such heartbreaking genius that it served as both a peace treaty and the victor's final gentle word. The castle of flash that Porter Wagoner had built now stood silent. The king was alone on his throne. For the second time in 7 years, he had been defied and abandoned by his girl singer. The first, Norma Jean, had been a quiet, devastating act of personal autonomy. She had chosen a life over the show. This second departure was a public, catastrophic act of corporate warfare. Dolly had chosen to build her own empire and had proven his was no longer big enough to hold her. Both women had left for the same fundamental reason: Porter Wagoner's desperate, all-consuming pathological need for control. That original wound from his childhood, the terror of the tenant farmer, the boy who had nothing and was beholden to everyone, had grown into a man who would rather be a king in an empty castle than a partner in a shared one. He had defeated poverty, his greatest fear, only to be consumed by solitude, his own greatest creation. But the machine, as we know, must be fed. The Porter Wagoner Show was still a syndicated juggernaut, a massive corporation with contracts to fulfill and advertisers to appease. The girl singer slot was not just a role, it was a product line. It had to be filled. And so, Porter Wagoner, a man now 47 years old, wounded and enraged, went back out to find a third replacement. This in itself is a tragedy. He did not pause, he did not reflect, he did not change the dynamic, he simply mechanically replaced the part. The woman he hired was a talented singer named Barbara Leah. The audience by this point was weary. They had been forced to forget Norma Jean, forced to accept Dolly, and were now being asked to invest in a third woman. It was a hopeless task. Barbara Lee was not just replacing Dolly Parton, she was replacing a supernova. The magic was gone. The tension, the fire, the warring titans' chemistry that had made the Porter and Dolly years so electric was absent. What was left was a hollow professional performance. The show continued. It limped on, a glittering ghost of its former self, for another 7 years. But the world outside the studio walls had moved on. The 1970s were no longer the 1960s. The Nashville sound that Porter had pioneered was being challenged on all sides. On one side, you had the outlaw movement, Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings in denim and leather, singing with a raw, defiant grit that made Porter's nudie suits look like children's costumes. On the other, you had the slick pop crossover sound of artists like Olivia Newton-John and John Denver. Porter's show, once revolutionary, was now a relic. It was a nostalgic holdover, a comfortable Saturday evening routine. But it was no longer the center of the universe. It was a time capsule. In 1981, after 21 years and 686 episodes, the Porter Wagoner Show was finally, quietly, canceled. The fortress had been decommissioned. The man who had been a television king for 2 decades was now, for the first time since 1960, unemployed. Of course, he was not poor. He was extravagantly wealthy. He had his publishing. He had his investments. He had defeated the ghost of the Great Depression. But he had lost the one thing that had defined his entire adult life, his platform. He had lost his control. He retreated, as so many do, to the one place that would always have him, the Grand Ole Opry. He was and always would be Mr. Grand Ole Opry. He was an icon, a living legend, but his relevance was now almost entirely nostalgic. He was the man who used to be on television, the man who used to sing with Dolly Parton. His health, which had been strained for years under the immense pressure of maintaining his empire, began to fail. He suffered from heart problems. The anger, the stress, the relentless white-knuckled grip he had kept on his world for 30 years had taken a brutal physical toll. He was a man who had built a glittering rhinestone empire only to find himself its lonely, isolated ruler. He had achieved the American dream, and in doing so had become a perfect, glittering monument to solitude. And what of the woman who had fled that fortress? What of the woman whose erasure had been the first act of that empire's long, slow decline? While Porter was waging his war with Dolly, and while he was fading into lonely nostalgia, Norma Jean was living a different life entirely, a life of radical, quiet victory. She had done exactly what she said she was going to do. She had married Jody Taylor. She had returned to Oklahoma. She built a home. She had, in short, a life. She had the one thing that Porter, in his fortress, and Dolly, on her rocket ship of fame, could no longer possess: normalcy. She had peace. Her career did not end. It transformed. She had willingly, consciously, traded the blinding, high-wattage spotlight of television for the warm, steady glow of the community. She remained always a beloved and deeply respected member of the Grand Ole Opry. This was her sanctuary. This was the one stage in Nashville, perhaps the only one, where she was not defined by her relationship to Porter Wagoner. Here, she was not the woman who came before Dolly. Here, she was Norma Jean. She would fly in from Oklahoma. She would step out onto that sacred circle of wood, and the audience would give her a standing ovation. It was not the screaming of television fans. It was the deep, abiding respect of a family. She would sing her hits, her rough-edged hillbilly voice now richer, more mature. She was not a ghost. She was a matriarch. She handled her legacy with a profound, almost heartbreaking grace. In the decades that followed, as the legend of Porter and Dolly became one of the foundational myths of country music, Norma Jean was, by necessity, cast as the prelude, the opening act, the footnote. She was interviewed, of course. Journalists would come to her digging for gossip, for bitterness, for resentment. They wanted to hear her say that Porter was a tyrant. They wanted to hear her say that Dolly had stolen her life, and she gave them nothing. She refused to be a victim. She refused to be bitter. She spoke of Porter Wagoner with a quiet, careful respect. He was the man who had given her the greatest opportunity of her life. She spoke of her time on the show with gratitude, and when asked about leaving, her answer was always the same, simple and profound. I wanted a home. I wanted a life, and I got it. She was perhaps the only person in this entire sprawling drama who was truly free. She had not been defeated. She had escaped. This is the central and most profound irony of the entire story. Porter Wagoner, the man who sang A Satisfied Mind every night for 30 years, a song about the emptiness of wealth and the virtue of a simple, peaceful heart, was the one man in the story who never had one. He was a man tormented by his past, consumed by his ambition, and left alone by his need for control. Norma Jean, the woman he erased, the woman he replaced, the woman the world forgot, was the one who lived it. She was the one who actually had the satisfied mind. She had chosen peace over riches, autonomy over fame. She lost the spotlight, but she won her life. This quiet, dignified standoff, Porter, the lonely king in his castle, and Norma Jean, the quiet survivor in her Oklahoma home, could have continued for decades. But the story had one last brilliant and heartbreaking chapter. In the mid-2000s, Porter Wagoner was an old man. He was in his late 70s and failing health, a living legend shuffling through the halls of the Opry. He was an icon, yes, but a dusty one. A new generation of artists, however, had begun to look past the rhinestones. Musicians like Marty Stewart, a brilliant traditionalist and a historian of the genre, saw something else. He saw the thin man from West Plains. He saw the authentic Ozark voice that had been buried under a half-century of flash and television spectacle. Marty Stewart approached his hero with an idea. Let's make one last album. But not a showman album. Let's make a real one. The result, released in 2007, was the album Wagon Master. It was and is a staggering masterpiece. It was a revelation. Marty Stewart had stripped away every last rhinestone, every trace of the television host. What was left was the voice. It was the sound of the 19-year-old butcher's boy from West Plains. It was raw, authentic, and trembling, with a lifetime of unspoken pain. The songs were dark, confessional, and deeply personal. He sang about madness, about his childhood, and about his own mortality. It was the most honest, vulnerable, and authentic music he had ever recorded. It was the sound of a man at the very end of his life finally taking off his armor. The album was a critical smash. A new generation raised on rock and alternative music suddenly discovered Porter Wagoner. He was profiled in rock magazines. He was hailed as a gothic, raw American original. He even opened for the rock band The White Stripes at a sold-out concert in Madison Square Garden. At 80 years old, Porter Wagoner was suddenly the coolest man in music. He had, in the final act, found his satisfied mind. He had found authenticity. And this is the final tragic irony of Porter Wagoner's life. This artistic rebirth, this final brilliant moment of truth, had come just in time for him to die. As the album was being released to universal acclaim, Porter Wagoner was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer. His decline was swift. He was hospitalized. The end was near. On October 28, 2007, Porter Wagoner, the thin man from West Plains, the king of the rhinestone suit, the lonely mogul, died. He was 80 years old. The fortress was at last empty. His funeral was, as his life had been, a national event. The Grand Ole Opry House was filled to capacity. The cameras of the world were there to capture it. And here, in this final scene, the three paths of our story collide for the last time. At the front, in the center of it all, was Dolly Parton. She was the star, even here. She wept, openly and heartbrokenly. She approached the casket, and she famously said, in a voice trembling with a lifetime of complex love, "He was my country music daddy. He was the one who gave me my first big break, and I will always love him." Her grief was real. Her respect was real. And her presence as a global superstar was the ultimate complex testament to his legacy. She was the star he had created, and the star who had surpassed him. But the cameras, in their focus on Dolly, almost missed the other woman. It is said that sitting quietly, a few rows back, was a dignified 70-year-old woman with white hair. She was not swarmed by reporters. It was Norma Jean. She had flown in from Oklahoma. She was there to pay her respects to the man who had, 47 years earlier, given her the chance of a lifetime. The man who had been her partner, her boss, and perhaps her lover. The man who had, in his rage, engineered her erasure. And the man she had, in her quiet strength, survived. Her presence was the final silent word. She was not the weeping superstar. She was not the broken-hearted widow. She was the survivor, the one who had escaped, the one who had chosen life. And in that moment, the entire story becomes clear. We see the three figures: Porter, the tragic king in his casket, dead from the weight of his own empire; Dolly, the weeping empress, the one who had won the war and now inherited the world, and Norma Jean, the quiet woman in the back row, the one who had been erased by them both, the one who had simply endured. Porter Wagoner's legacy is that of a complex, brilliant, and tragic king. He was a man so haunted by the ghosts of poverty that he built a fortress of flash and control to keep them out, a fortress so secure that it ultimately left him brilliant, rich, and utterly alone. Norma Jean's legacy is that of the survivor. She may have been erased from the mainstream story, but her life is perhaps the most radical lesson of all. In a world defined by spectacle, by ambition, and by the tragic, fiery ends of its stars, Norma Jean simply left. She chose dignity. She chose peace. She lost the spotlight, but she, and she alone, truly found a satisfied mind.